Morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is the cartoon in the Zimbabwe Daily a few days ago. Most Zimbabweans, I think, they'll be familiar with the character in the cartoon there. Being quoted as these opposition guys are a bunch of useless cowards. How can they run away from their party? This is a giveaway, of course, is that if you zoom in, you will see that it says the Nairobi Times and then talks of the Zimbabwe opposition Triple C leaders. The most recent report was that Tendai Biti was taking a sabbatical from politics. That's what he said. But he'll be back. And in January, as many Zimbabweans would know, Nelson Chamisa resigned from being president of that party in a half. So this is Professor Jonathan Moyo, who has been holed up in Kenya ever since the 2017 military coup. What makes this laughable is that he is holed up in Kenya. So this is a classical case of the kettle calling the pot black. He was making funny of Nelson Chamisa and Tendai Biti, saying they are cowards. They are resigning from their own party. And yet, he too, and many of the other ZANU-PF leaders left Zimbabwe in a huff. Indeed, their mad dash for safety was a matter of life and death. As the likes of him and Gasukwere, they were fired at from when they were in their house by their own former ZANU-PF colleagues during that military coup. And so, for him to be saying they're running away, they're cowards, well, what about him? He's holed up in Kenya now, living under the bridge. And he was running away from his own ZANU-PF colleagues. So it's interesting, actually. But I like the reaction of some of the MDC Triple C head. They could only curse when they saw the article and Professor Moyo's comment. This is typical of the Zimbabwe politics. I think the resigning of Nelson Chamisa from Triple C was a clear case where here is a leader that had all along, ever since he launched Triple C 2 years before then, had maintained that Triple C was a democratic party. And when people said, well, if it's going to be a democratic party, you really need to set it on a democratic footing by having a democratic constitution, by electing leaders in a democratic and open way into the various positions, have a proper structure with responsibility. He refused. He wanted to control everything himself. And so he refused to have a constitution. He refused to appoint anybody else. He and a few others were literally nominated by him. He nominated himself as the president of the new party, Triple C, and then he nominated a few others into key positions for which they were not elected by anybody. And that was it. And he called it strategic ambiguity. The strategic ambiguity has since backfired badly on him. Ever since the August election, others have taken advantage of this strategic ambiguity, notably the individual declared himself to be the Secretary General of the party, Savangu. And he wrote a letter to the Speaker of the House and then to the Speaker of the Senate, declaring that some of the newly elected C members were no longer members of the party. And therefore, then they should be kicked out of Parliament and the Senate, respectively. Much to the annoyance of Chamisa, but he was helpless to stop it. Because when he challenged these letters claiming that these people were no longer members of the party in court, the court said, well, okay, so who is the Secretary General? And he couldn't prove that there was anybody else as Secretary General because of this problem of having failed to have a constitution, a structure, and properly elected officials. And to be fair to Professor Jonathan Moyo, he was one of those who had been arguing that Chamisa should appoint, should have a proper constitution and structure, etc. And Chamisa and the party faithful, the diehards, were out in arms to denounce Professor Moyo and anybody else who argued that there should be a proper structure. And when he resigned in January, he resigned in a huff because he said Triple C had been infiltrated. And the very thing that he was saying was not appointing anybody to stop infiltration. So the very thing that he was trying to avoid actually happened. But what is interesting here is how the Triple C diehards were now cursing at Professor Jonathan Moyo for saying these Triple C leaders are cowards. Of course they are cowards. As much as he himself may be called a coward for doing exactly the same thing that they are doing, but nonetheless, the fact still remains that Triple C leaders have proven to be absolutely useless. The last 23 years, the people of Zimbabwe have risked life and limb and livelihoods to elect them as the country's opposition leaders with the principal task of implementing the democratic reforms to stop ZANU-PF freaking the elections. They failed to implement even one token reform. Of course, they're useless. But the party faithful, when they hear that their leader is being criticized, they jump to his support and they're prepared to defend him. This is at the heart of why Zimbabwe is a failed state. Many Zimbabweans see party as their loyalty is to the party and to the leadership of the party, not knowing that their loyalty should be to the principles or the values. In this case here, freedom, making sure we have got free, fair, and credible elections. That, as far as the opposition is concerned, was the primary task they were tasked to carry out. So, as long as the opposition is carrying out that task, that you can support them for. But when they've deviated from it, for 23 years they failed to implement even one reform, you've got to say to yourself, well, you should stop supporting blindly leaders who have failed. But some of these party supporters, that is asking for too much. Their loyalty is to the party. Their loyalty is to Chamisa. And so we end up with this situation where our politics is governed more like, if you are not with us, you are against us. With you on what? If we are still chasing the same values, i.e., we want the opposition to implement democratic reforms to ensure we've got free, fair, and credible elections, then yes, I am with you. But if the opposition have failed to deliver that, how can you expect me to continue to be faithful to the opposition? There are more important things at stake. And this is what some people are failing to understand. You define what is it that you want to do. Just as much as with ZANU-PF itself. During the War of Liberation, the nation was fighting for freedom, justice, prosperity for all Zimbabweans. When ZANU-PF got into power, one man, one vote was thrown out of the window. Didn't care about one man, one vote. ZANU-PF's number one priority has been to retain power at all costs. Anyone who continued to support ZANU-PF on that basis, it lost the plot. We can't spend all our lives fighting over the same issue. Somebody, we fight for it today. When they get into power, they change the goalposts, they are pursuing something else. So we've got to fight for the same thing all over again. And you continue supporting such a party and such leaders because you've always supported them. No, you support the Commonwealth. What is in the interest of the society? What is in the interest of the country? And in this particular case, what is in the interest of Zimbabwe is to have a democratic nation in which everyone has a meaningful say in the governance of the country. This whole idea that ZANU-PF has got the divine right to rule the country is an outrage. What is so special about ZANU-PF, Robert Mugabe, or Mnangagwa, that they should decide that no, they are the only ones who are suitable to rule the country? What about if they fail? Are we stuck with them? Which is exactly what has happened here. We've been stuck with ZANU-PF for the last 44 years because they believe they've got the divine right to rule the country. And unfortunately, there are a lot of Zimbabweans, including the war veterans, who have been brainwashed into believing that Zimbabwe's independence is only secured by ZANU-PF leaders ruling. Even when the economy was in shambles, as it is now, they still continue to support ZANU-PF blindly. And unfortunately, that culture is being carried on by the opposition. The opposition have failed to implement the democratic reforms to stop ZANU-PF rigging the elections. And to continue to support them blindly, regardless, is to miss the point completely. We have got a long way to go. To have a healthy and functioning democracy in Zimbabwe, we have got a long way to go. As long as we've got an electorate that is so ignorant, naive, and gullible, they can easily be conned, as ZANU-PF has conned the war veterans. And now we can see that the opposition has also conned the electorate into participating in flawed elections and refusing to accept that the opposition has failed to meet its mandate that the nation is set up for it, is the reason why we are stuck. ZANU-PF has benefited from this naivety because ZANU-PF blatantly rigged last year's elections, but because the opposition participated, and the opposition conned so many millions of ordinary Zimbabweans to participate in these flawed elections, ZANU-PF got away with the rigged elections. SADC turned around and said, well, if the ordinary Zimbabweans are participating in their millions and are happy with participating in a flawed elections, who are the outsiders to tell them that we should not participate? They'd been told, don't participate, and they didn't want to listen. So I think change in Zimbabwe will come if we have got an opposition electorate, ruling party electorate, that are willing to see the bigger picture and realize that Zimbabwe's destiny cannot be tied to a party or to an individual leader. It has got to be tied to ideas. Free, fair, and credible elections. The need to implement the democratic reforms so that we've got free, fair, and credible elections. If CCC have failed to implement those reforms, which they have, then we must look for somebody else who will. The idea that we must remain faithful, blindly faithful to CCC and Chamisa and company is an outrage. After 23 years, they failed to implement even one reform. So why should we remain faithful to them? It's not a choice between ZANU-PF and CCC. There's a much bigger picture. The choice is between a democratically functioning Zimbabwe and ZANU-PF, a democratically functioning Zimbabwe and CCC. Rejecting CCC does not mean you're accepting ZANU-PF. Rejecting ZANU-PF does not mean you're accepting CCC. Rejecting ZANU-PF because it is rigging the elections is to accept that there is a bigger value, Zimbabwe, a democratically functioning and healthy country, Zimbabwe. Rejecting CCC because they failed to implement the reforms so that we can elect opposition parties who will implement those reforms is in the interest of Zimbabwe. That is the bigger picture. Thank you very much for listening, and have a good night.